Malcolm X said, "We need more light." John Lewis more recently said, "You are a light. You are the light. Never let anyone, any person, or any force dampen, dim, or diminish your light. Study the path of others to make your way easier and more abundant." On a day in May 1876, 145 years ago this year, in a talk that led to the founding of the first ethical society, a 25-year-old Felix Adler said, "The past speaks to us in 1,000 voices, warning and comforting, animating and stirring to action. What its great thinkers have thought and written on the deepest problems of life, shall we not hear and enjoy?" And in Felix's day in 1876, some of the thinkers and activists who he looked back on to honor were the people who had ended slavery and had changed the nation significantly. Today, we're going to hear about a thinker and activist who was a generation older than Felix and who at the same time lived long enough to follow Adler into ethical culture leadership. For almost 20 years, I used to write about women's history for the web. And from the beginning, I included Black women as women. Every February, I would get some emails asking, "What is this Black History Month? When is going to be White History Month?" Well, perhaps this month is also White History Month, a time for white people to reflect on our role in the racialized history of this country. A few years ago, I was asked by a Black woman in another ethical society, what could possibly have been in the minds of white enslavers in our history? How could they have justified their role in that history, claiming to own human beings? Did anyone change their mind? And what does all that mean for us today? And so I spoke then, and I speak again today, on someone who has a relationship to our ethical movement, but much more importantly, someone who could speak authentically about that question. What did white people in the time of enslavement do and think? What did it take to change their minds? And so I'm going to focus on a time in our history as a nation, a time when what was called the peculiar institution laid the groundwork for today's racial injustice. Originally, the phrase peculiar institution was used with the meaning of peculiar as our own, as in this was a different kind of enslavement than had ever been practiced before in history, and as in this was part then of the structure of the nation. My purpose today isn't to give you the history of how enslavement of some human beings by others came to be, or the big picture of how that ended or evolved. But today I want to tell you the story of one man's life, a life that shows us some of the details about how that history happened. Moncure Daniel Conway, whose life is my window into history today, was born on March 17, 1832 in Stafford County, Virginia. Now, Stafford County is an area of Virginia not far from the Jamestown settlement, a place where 200 years before Conway's life, the English colonists took into captivity the adult woman called Pocahontas, daughter of Chief Powhatan of the Powhatan Confederacy, an area that is today at the southern edge of the wide Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. Moncure Daniel Conway. His three names come from the Moncures, the Daniels, and the Conways, so-called Virginia first families. His father, Walter Peyton Conway, was a, quote, gentleman farmer who owned a textile mill and who served at times as a county judge and state representative. Moncure's mother, born Margaret Stone Daniel, was the granddaughter of Thomas Stone of Maryland, who signed the Declaration of Independence. Moncure's uncle and father ardently defended the doctrine of states' rights in Virginia to defend enslavement. Moncure's great uncle, Peter Vivian Daniel, was a United States Supreme Court justice who would, in various decisions, uphold enslavement as lawful. Peter Daniel voted to uphold the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and was one of the justices supporting the Dred Scott decision of 1857 when Moncure Conway was 25 years old. Two of Moncure's brothers would go on in the Civil War to fight on the side of the Confederacy. During his early years, Moncure Conway grew up in a household where his father held as property several dozen people of African descent. These people mostly worked in the textile mill, some in the house, and a few worked on the land. His father and mother had religiously converted from their childhood religions to Methodism. In Moncure's childhood, Methodism in the South was beginning to split between two different factions. One was pro-enslavement, and Moncure's uncle Eustace Conway was an ardent member of that side. Another faction of the Methodists in the South held that enslavement was wrong and should be gradually abolished. Moncure's father, Walter, was originally part of that side. Walter Conway was locally also known for opposing any violent treatment of those people who were enslaved. Moncure went to a Methodist college in Pennsylvania, where he graduated in 1849. His mentor there was anti-enslavement. And after Moncure saw a Black man lynched, he turned to a study of the law to try to change the system that turned a blind eye on lynching and gave no consequences for it. He soon saw that he wasn't going to make enough difference as a lawyer, and so he decided to become a Methodist minister, riding a circuit in Virginia. During those years, he unsuccessfully proposed a system of free schools in Virginia, which had no free school at the time. It would have been aimed primarily at poorer white children. But those in Virginia who opposed those schools did so out of a fear that the schools would bring in, quote, northern ideas, meaning, of course, opposition to enslavement. Moncure's religious ideas kept evolving, and he found himself no longer able to be a Methodist. He became a Unitarian instead, and he went to Harvard to get a degree there in ministry. While at Harvard in Boston, he met such local figures as Ralph Waldo Emerson and Theodore Parker, and anti-slavery advocates William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Years later, Conway published the first biography of Emerson, written after Emerson's death. In his own autobiography, Moncure Conway writes of seeing in 1854 an incident in Boston, the freeing of Anthony Burns. I'm wondering how many of you here are familiar with this event from American history classes. You know, I have come to believe that this event was one of the major turning points in American history, and yet very few people know of it. Burns was a self-taught preacher who had been enslaved very close to where Conway grew up. In fact, Conway knew his so-called owner. Burns had escaped from Virginia to Boston and had changed his name to try to escape detection. But the next year after he escaped, he was seen on the street by someone who recognized him, turned over, and he was arrested under the provisions of the Fugitive Slave Act to be sent back to the man who claimed ownership. Massachusetts state law had ended enslavement in that state in the 1790s, but the Fugitive Slave Act as a federal law overrode Massachusetts state law. Anthony Burns was jailed in the courthouse. On May 26th, a crowd, including abolitionists, both white and Black, stormed the courthouse to free him. A federal marshal was killed in the fight. Burns was sent to the South when it failed. Abolitionists then freed him by paying his so-called owner. Burns came back to Massachusetts, then moved to Canada, where he was safe from the provisions of the Fugitive Slave Act, which could have enslaved him again on just the word of any white man. The Anthony Burns incident escalated the culture war of the time. William Lloyd Garrison publicly burned the Fugitive Slave Act and the US Constitution. Moncure Conway was present during that fight to try to free Burns. He was an observer and part of the crowd. And seeing what happened caused him to question, should he have been more active a participant and not just an observer? The event solidified his commitment to the anti-slavery cause. Well, after he graduated, he was called as a minister to serve the First Unitarian Church of Washington, D.C. After a few months there, he preached what Horace Greeley in a newspaper article called a straight out anti-slavery sermon. There were members of the congregation, though, who still enslaved people. Slavery was legal in Washington, and that was likely a factor to the reactions to the sermon. Many of the leaders in the congregation were appalled at the political nature. A committee deeply deplored it. Well, but Conway took their lack of further action as encouragement. He wrote a pamphlet stating that ministers and churchgoers were in fact obligated to attack injustice. He wrote that they had a duty to oppose powers and laws that were unjust. Well, that resulted in a warning from a committee of the church that political speech was incompatible with, quote, higher purposes of the church. Well, during his time in DC, Conway also traveled around, including to Pennsylvania and Boston, giving anti-slavery speeches. He was not a full-out Garrisonian abolitionist yet. William Lloyd Garrison in that time actually called for the northern states to secede from the Union if slavery were not abolished. That position was vigorously denounced by the leaders in the South, the same leaders who defended states' rights to continue enslavement. Moncure Conway still believed that laws could be changed, avoiding a split of the Union. Others in his circle supported more immediate abolition, even if it risked a split. And then came a particular event that changed things for Conway. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, while he was in residence as a senator in Washington, was a member of the congregation where Conway was the minister. In 1856, Senator Sumner gave an impassioned two-day speech on the floor of the Senate. He blasted the pro-slavery faction in Kansas as murderous robbers. He verbally attacked Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois and Senator Andrew Butler from South Carolina. Douglas and Butler had previously insulted Sumner in speeches, including Butler alluding to Sumner promoting interracial marriage in some language with sexual innuendo. So Senator Sumner's speech, which also included sexual innuendo, implied that Senator Butler had chosen as his mistress slavery. Senator Douglas later said while Sumner was speaking, "This damn fool is going to get himself killed by some other damn fool." Well, you know, I was thinking a lot about what happened next last month and through the events that have happened in Congress. 2 days after that speech, Congressman Preston Brooks, a cousin of Senator Butler, entered the Senate. On the floor of the Senate, he beat Senator Sumner over the head with a cane, trapping him under his desk. He beat him so hard that Sumner was blinded by his own blood. He continued after Sumner broke free of the desk, continuing even after the cane broke, beating him with the gold head. Those who tried to help were threatened by a friend of Brooks who brandished both a cane and a pistol. Sumner's beating caused such severe head injuries that Sumner was bedridden for over a year, and it kept Sumner from fulfilling his Senate duties for years. The House refused to vote to expel Representative Brooks, who had beaten Senator Sumner. The congressman resigned anyway and returned home to be celebrated in his home state and then reelected. Many from the so-called slave states actually sent him new canes to express their support for the beating. Now, that beating probably did make it into your American history books, but it's usually minimized. It was certainly another point where the polarization in the nation was clear. As Emerson wrote of the incident, I do not see how a barbarous community and a civilized community can constitute one state. I think we must get rid of slavery or we must get rid of freedom. Moncure Conway, as Sumner's minister, was especially outraged at the beating. He regularly visited Sumner in the hospital and later at home. About 6 weeks after the caning, Conway gave a sermon, more political than ever before. He denounced slavery and warned of a possible civil war. And that did it for the congregation. They fired him. He then went to Cincinnati, Ohio to serve an explicitly anti-slavery Unitarian congregation. He was there for 6 years. During those years, his religious ideas continued to evolve. He first became a well-known member of the radical wing of the Unitarians, and then he declared that he was no longer either a Christian or a Unitarian. The congregation itself followed him and redefined itself as a free church, not associated with any dogma, losing about 1/3 of their members with that change. Early in his time at the Cincinnati church before this split, he met and married his wife, Ellen Davis Dana, a Unitarian and abolitionist herself. She was also active in the growing women's rights movement. Well, during those years, right after his marriage, he returned to visit his family and to introduce his new wife to them. On this visit, he had many conversations with the so-called servants, as those who were enslaved were always called in his family. They had already heard that he had taken on the cause of abolition. On this visit, for the first time, they honestly shared with him their stories of hardship and their dreams of freedom. As Conway tells the story, he was shocked to hear these stories. Even though he had personally come to see that ending slavery was the ethical thing to do, he still thought, because he had never heard anything else, that the enslaved people themselves were satisfied with their position in life, especially in families like his, where violence was not used by the so-called owners. He tells in his autobiography of one special servant his father regularly sent on trips to Baltimore with large sums of money. Conway writes that he had previously thought, if that man really wanted freedom, why would he come back to Virginia? On this trip with his new wife, Conway got some answers. Because the man was worried about his family, his wife and children in Virginia. He was not going to risk their safety by winning his own freedom. So Conway began to question more deeply his own assumptions. Of course, it hadn't been safe before for people who were in almost constant connection to him throughout his growing years to say one single word to him about their real hopes and dreams. Of course, people really wanted freedom, even if they knew that they could not tell that to those who were part of enslaving them. It sounds so obvious from the perspective of our time, but for Conway in that moment, it was a revelation, revealing not just his former oblivious ignorance, but revealing one of the ways the system itself worked to keep the enslavers uninformed. And that's a lesson for us today. We hear increasingly the cries for Black lives to matter, and we also see many people confused and resistant. But that is part of how the system of racism maintains itself, keeping some people afraid often to speak their truth, and some people therefore ignorant. Even for the abolitionist Moncure Conway, who had put his career and livelihood on the line for his beliefs, he realized how much he'd still been carrying false assumptions. I started thinking about this with a question. How did white people in the South feel about what they were doing? Conway, in his memoirs later and other writings, tells us something of the answer. As resistance to enslavement grew, so did the use of violence by many white people in suppressing even a little resistance. Conway called such violence a logical consequence of slavery. Being enslaved is not a natural condition, he argued. Increasing resistance and rebellion, though, produces increasing fear, which produces increasing violence, which produces increasing resistance and rebellion. It's a vicious cycle. And at the same time, there were those who enslaved people who believed that good treatment was good enough. They didn't hear any of their so-called servants complain, and they didn't ask themselves whether people could dare under that system to express their reality to people who were part of enslaving them. So think about that for today too, that a system of injustice based on skin color and perceived race may very well logically create resistance, and resistance leads to more and more suppression of those who are oppressed. Only dismantling and eradicating the system of oppression itself will stop the violence that disproportionately targets one part of the nation's people. Back to the story of Moncure Conway's visit home. That visit resulted in a lot of learning for Conway, but it also resulted in a split with his family. When Ellen and Moncure first arrived on that visit, a little 4-year-old girl came running to greet them, daughter of house servants in the euphemism of the time. A little girl of African descent ran to greet them. And Ellen, Moncure's abolitionist wife from Ohio, picked up the little girl and hugged her. For all that Moncure Conway's family had taught him that good treatment was the right way to relate to the so-called servants, hugging this little girl was for them far over the line. It became apparent that Moncure's family would, after that incident, never approve of his wife. The story of the hug soon spread around town, and on a visit into town, Moncure overheard plans to tar and feather him and Ellen. So Moncure and Ellen left far earlier than they'd planned. It was 17 years before he reconciled with his family. He did maintain a correspondence with his mother, but she regularly chided him in letters for his anti-slavery views. That visit was in the mid-1850s. Moncure and Ellen returned to Cincinnati, where he continued to preach against enslavement. He also edited a weekly anti-slavery newspaper and traveled on the national abolitionist circuit. When Lincoln was elected president, the Southern states formed the Confederacy as they saw the election as the death knell of that peculiar institution. And that way, we know, led to the Civil War. Moncure's father had become increasingly pro-slavery as the war approached. So much so that Moncure's mother moved to Pennsylvania for the duration of the war. After the war began, Conway found himself in Washington, D.C. again briefly, this time for a lecture series supporting abolition at the Smithsonian. He argued there that if the president would declare the abolition of slavery, it would weaken the Confederacy and end the war quickly. He and a Unitarian minister, William Henry Channing, managed to meet with President Lincoln about this proposal. And of course, we know from events that Lincoln failed to carry this out for several more years. It was during this trip to DC that Conway heard that the Union Army had taken control of the area around Stafford, Virginia, where his father still lived. And in that moment, Moncure realized that he had an opportunity. He could safely travel now to Stafford County, and with the protection of Union troops, take the people his father enslaved and bring them north to freedom. In his later years, when he was writing his autobiography, Conway had become even more of a rationalist, a complete disbeliever in the spirit world and any deity. But he still tells this following story with disbelief that it happened this way. Yet, because of his respect for truth, he has to report it. So he went to sleep in DC that night, prepared to travel south in the morning. And he suddenly woke up in the middle of the night with an overwhelming and unexplainable urge that told him to go to a specific house in Georgetown, then the area in Washington, D.C., where Freedmen lived. He couldn't believe this very specific impulse. But even though he didn't believe it, he decided he might as well get up in the middle of the night and see what it was all about. And when he got to the house in Georgetown, he found the several dozen people who had been enslaved by his family. They had heard that that Moncure was in Washington, and they had already come to Washington. They had intended to send a messenger to him in the morning to let him know. And if it had not been for that middle of the night unexplainable impulse, Conway would by then have gone on his way to Stafford County. Well, that's pretty dramatic, but it's not the end of the drama. Moncure Conway had been able to obtain in Ohio, north of Cincinnati, and the congregation he was serving, some land. He was determined to get these people there. That meant crossing through Maryland, where slavery was still legal and the Fugitive Slave Act was still in force. At that time, there was no train that went from Washington, D.C. through Baltimore to the north. You had to get off the train in Baltimore and walk a mile to a separate train station. So there was Moncure Conway, a 30-year-old white man with 31 Black men, women, and children in Baltimore. Under the Fugitive Slave Act, everyone subject to arrest. They first walked through an all-white neighborhood. Conway tells how, despite his reluctance, those with him talked him into tying them together with rope so he could act as if he still owned them, all to protect their very lives as white crowds gathered around this unusual procession. And then on this walk, they came to an all-Black neighborhood where free Black people lived. The crowds in this neighborhood were not so positive about a white man taking a crowd of roped together Black people through the streets. Conway describes how it became ominous. He became afraid for his own life until some of those with him passed word to the crowd about what was really happening. The ropes tying them together came off, and the crowd was shouting, not in anger, but in celebration and joy. Well, that's still not the end of the drama. When they got to the train station that would take them north, Conway followed the protocol and so saw those with him to the colored waiting room. And then he went to buy tickets for all of them. Nope, the ticket seller said he could not sell tickets for Black people to go to the north. Why not? Because of the Fugitive Slave Act. If someone later claimed ownership, the person could sue the railroad for complicity and property loss, and the cost to the railroad could be huge. Railroad policy forbid them from selling tickets to or for any Black person, as they might be faking their papers, even if they had papers showing that they were free. Conway despaired. He had not realized this barrier to his plan. He shared his frustration to the ticket seller, who until then had not realized that these people were claimed by Conway's family as slaves. And thus the man before him had a great financial interest in the people in the other waiting room. The ticket seller disappeared. Conway was still in the waiting room trying to figure out next steps. The ticket seller returned. He had realized that this was not just some radical asking the railroad to take a risk, but someone who was himself making a personal sacrifice. That impressed the ticket seller enough to take a risk of his own. Though he could not sell tickets to the people Conway was with, he had found an empty baggage car. He was willing to allow them to sneak onto that car for the trip to Ohio. He showed them the car, and everyone, including Conway, got in for the journey to Ohio. Conway tells how the adults in the moving railroad car got the children to sleep while the adults watched out the small window as they proceeded north. Suddenly, stopping at one small station, those watching shouted and woke up everyone else, including the children. Conway wrote of this moment, "I observed that every eye danced, every tongue was loosened, and after some singing, they all dropped off to sleep. It was not until the next day that I learned that the station, which had wrought such a transformation, was the dividing line between slave and free states. How they knew it, I cannot divine. It was a small place, but there the shadow of slavery ended." Conway accompanied them to their new land near Yellow Springs, Ohio, where some descendants still live. Conway returned to Cincinnati, and later he moved even farther away, but he continued to support that community as long as he lived. A bit later in the war, during another period of Union occupation of his home area, he visited his former home again. He expected to find it destroyed. But the Union Army had realized that the home was associated with him, a known abolitionist, and so his home had been converted into a hospital for the wounded. Walt Whitman served as a nurse there. As the war progressed, Conway became increasingly uncomfortable with another reality. In abolitionist circles, his Southern heritage triggered suspicion about his real allegiances. The people he was associated with in the cause for which he was risking so much were unable to see him as fully trustworthy. And so he took on a different work. He took a position with a congregation in London, England. This group had moved, like Conway had, beyond Unitarianism to a more radical, dogma-free form of unity, based only on ethics. Does that sound familiar? And Conway also took on the mission while there of another kind of action, also not often mentioned in our history books. His aim was to keep the British out of the war, when many expected that the UK could very well decide to back the Confederacy with their close ties to the cotton industry. If the UK had entered the war on the side of the South, the Civil War would likely have been far longer and bloodier, with maybe a different ending. Moncure and Ellen had moved to London then in 1863, and they were supported in this mission by the American abolitionists. He spoke and wrote there about the realities of the peculiar institution from his personal experience. He shared gruesome stories he personally knew from the county where he grew up. He talked about his own learning that you cannot trust that people, just because people don't tell you they want to be free, that they are happy with their situation. He did get in trouble once with the US Secretary of State when he, without any authorization, contacted an official of the Confederacy, offering that the US would stop pursuing the war if the Confederacy emancipated everyone who was enslaved. Well, Conway also, while he was in England, became a prolific writer and literary agent for many American writers. His religious ideas continued to move. He completely rejected theism and moved towards what we today call a humanism. He and the congregation he served moved even more completely outside of any traditional circles. Conway remained in England after the war until 1886. His friends included Charles Darwin and Charles Dickens. He helped to promote the writings of Thomas Paine, and he wrote a biography of Paine, almost single-handedly rescuing him from near obscurity. This is a key American religious political thinker and activist who in his time had almost been forgotten. Paine, wrote the first strong argument against why the United States cannot be conceived of as a Christian nation. Arguments today for that same thing draw heavily on Conway's reporting of this story. Arguments like the Treaty of Tripoli, which says that in no way is the United States a Christian nation. Moncure gave up his position in 1886 as the leader of that congregation in South Place in London. A young man, Stanton Coit, replaced him. Stanton Coit had trained in New York with Felix Adler. The London congregation became the South Place Ethical Society, a name it retains to this day. Coit was only there for 6 years, and then Conway was invited back, becoming thereby, in 1892, an ethical culture leader. Conway and his wife returned to America again 5 years later, this time because Ellen was dying of cancer, and she wanted to die in the States. After her death with the Spanish-American War, Conway became a pacifist. As a widower, he moved by himself to France, where he died in 1907. He is buried, though, in Westchester County, New York, with his wife and their children. In 2004, Virginia Governor Mark Warner issued a proclamation honoring Moncure Conway. And why did he do this? Conway was honored as the only known descendant of any of the founding fathers to himself personally and physically lead people who had been enslaved to freedom. Conway spent his life in both the religious and activist worlds. Perhaps this short sentence he wrote late in life best sums up his purpose. He wrote, "All religion and all ethics are summed up in justice." A sometimes dramatic story, an often dramatic life. I quoted Felix Adler at the start of this talk. The past speaks to us in 1,000 voices, waiting and comforting, warning and comforting, animating and stirring to action. And Adler followed that with a challenge. The future calls upon us to prepare its way. Dare we fail to answer its solemn summons? For me, the purpose of hearing of the past, of history like the story of Moncure Conway, is to inform our actions in the present in service of the future. So for Black History Month, I think it's worthwhile to ponder, as a majority white group today, how do white people learn to understand racism against Black people? How can any non-Black people be active in ending anti-Black racism, working towards a just, equal, inclusive, and diverse society? And what might those of us who are not Black be willing to give up so some others can be liberated? In Conway's story, he thought that the idea of abolition wasn't enough. He had to act, sometimes at great risk. So how do you move beyond just calling for your values of peace, love, freedom, truth, and justice to answering the call yourself? For those joining us on video, I invite you to reflect on those questions. Come join us another Sunday, usually at 11 a.m. Find out more about us at rysec.org.